evening. I'm Teresa Skupik, and this is Forum Daily for Thursday, February 27th. We begin tonight with yet another update on the looming trade war. U.S. President Donald Trump says he plans to impose tariffs on Canada and Mexico starting next Tuesday and not on April 2nd, as he established yesterday. Mr. Trump posted on Truth Social that illicit drugs such as fentanyl are being smuggled into the United States at, quote, unacceptable levels, and that import taxes would force other countries to crack down on the trafficking. Canada has already agreed to introduce new border security measures, and Canadian officials and premiers have been cycling through Washington to try and find out what else it can do to make Mr. Trump abandon his tariff plans. On a separate note, Mr. Trump is also doubling the 10% universal tariff charged on imports from China. And in response to Mr. Trump's tariff threat and comments about Canada becoming a 51st state, thousands of Canadians have signed a parliamentary petition urging Ottawa to bar U.S. President Donald Trump from Canada for threatening the country's sovereignty. An Alberta resident who describes himself as a fiercely proud Canadian recently initiated the electronic petition that now has over 28,000 signatures. Mr. Trump has threatened to impose widespread tariffs on Canadian products and has suggested that Canada become a U.S. state. The president usually attends the general gathering of G7 leaders, which is being held this June in Alberta. But NDP leader Jagmeet Singh thinks he should be banned from attending.
I also believe we need to ban Donald Trump from attending the G7 summit. Donald Trump should not be welcome here. Why would we invite someone who has threatened our very democracy, our very sovereignty? Why would we invite someone who has threatened our economic well-being? Why would we invite someone who threatens our allies and threatens the world's stability? Why would we allow a convicted criminal into our country? Why would we invite someone who has such disdain for multilateral organizations? Instead, what we should do is use the G7 summit as an opportunity to work with our allies on a plan to resist Donald Trump and his dangerous threats to the world.
But Canada's Natural Resources Minister disagrees and doesn't think the petition is constructive. Jonathan Wilkinson says that Canada can't cut itself off from the U.S. and, quote, float into the ocean.
Finally, we heard from Jagmeet Singh. He said that Trump should not be invited to the G7 because, look, he's calling for Canada to become part of the U.S. Do you think he should be there?
Look, President Trump obviously has said a number of things that have made Canadians, that have offended Canadians, that made many Canadians very angry. I have been very offended, and I have been quite angry about some of the things that he has said. But at the end of the day, we need to find pathways to work with the Americans. We are not going to sort of cut ourselves off and float into the ocean. They are going to be our neighbors going forward. And we need to find pathways to have better conversations than what we're having right now. That is what we are endeavoring to do. I don't think that simply trying to throw the president out of the G7 is a particularly constructive approach. But unfortunately, Mr. Singh has been throwing out all kinds of ideas that, to be honest with you, make very little sense. It's like when he said that we should cut off cobalt exports to the United States. Cobalt and lithium. We almost export none of both of those things. Like, at the end of the day, he needs to perhaps find new advisors who can actually provide something more thoughtful for him to say.
But the tension between Ottawa and Washington, D.C. isn't limited to those in the political arena. It's now found its way into the world of sports. Canada soccer coach Jesse Marsh was asked about the recent Four Nations face-off hockey final between Canada and the U.S., and as an American coaching the Canadian men's team, how comfortable he was with all the political stuff happening right now. Marsh responded by telling President Trump to, quote, lay off with the ridiculous rhetoric about Canada being a 51st state.
These international tournaments for Canada mean something different now. And, you know, as an American, I'd like to address the 51st state discourse, which I find unsettling and frankly insulting. Canada is a strong, independent nation that's deep-rooted in decency, really. And it's a place that values high ethics and respect. Unlike the polarized, disrespectful, and often now hate-fueled climate that's in the U.S. And look, Canada values a lot of fairness and unity. It's a place that I've learned as the national team coach where people really believe that their differences make them stronger. And honestly, it's one of the things that I've enjoyed the most about our team is that they exemplify this as human beings and as a team. And look, they're almost all first and second generation Canadians coming from different heritage and cultures, but they uniquely are incredibly proud to be Canadian, to represent their country, to give everything to each other and the love that they have for each other and playing for their country. And to me, this sounds very familiar to years past, right? So for me right now, I couldn't be prouder to be the Canadian national team coach. And I found a place where that embodies for me the ideals and morals of what not just football and a team is, but what life is. And that's integrity, respect, and the belief that good people can do great things together. And so if I have one message to our president, it's lay off the ridiculous rhetoric about Canada being the 51st state. As an American, I'm ashamed, right, of the arrogance and disregard that we've shown one of our historically oldest, strongest, and most loyal allies.
The 51-year-old Marsh, a former U.S. international, made his comments at a CONCACAF news conference at SoFi Stadium in Inglewood, California, the site of next month's CONCACAF Nations League finals featuring Canada, the U.S., Mexico, and Panama. Israel says Hamas has handed over the bodies of 4 Israelis who have been held hostage in Gaza. The handover happened early Thursday, and Hamas confirmed that 600 Palestinian prisoners had been released by Israel. Most were detainees returned to Gaza. Hamas said that the swap means it is now ready to negotiate phase 2 of the ceasefire. Egypt says that negotiations between Israel and Hamas on the next phase of the ceasefire have begun in Cairo, with the State Information Service saying that officials from Israel, Qatar, and the U.S. have started what they call intensive discussions on the second phase. David Mencer, spokesperson for Israel's prime minister, sat down with our news director, David Clement, for more on the release of the dead hostages.
Good to be with you, David. Our Prime Minister has just, in the last couple of hours, authorized and asked the Israeli delegation to go to Cairo to take forward negotiations. As you know, last night we secured the release of 4 of our murdered hostages after 510 days. Our forensic team here in Israel, the specialists who have had, unfortunately, far too much experience in dealing with the return of dead bodies, did identify them and shared their names with the public, who precisely they are. They are Ohad Yahalomi, Tzachi Idan, Shlomo Mansour, and Itzik El Garet. All of them were murdered inside Gaza. Shlomo Mansour, in particular, was killed on October 7th, his body taken into Gaza. The Prime Minister, I think, speaks for the whole nation when he reiterates our 3 war aims. Of course, chief amongst them is getting our people home, every single one of them. We'll do whatever we can to bring our people home. But of course, there is no scenario looking forward that Hamas can stay in control of Gaza. We are committed to removing their military ability and their governing capability. And of course, making sure that Gaza can never be a threat to Israel again. So we want our hostages home. We'll do everything we can to bring them home. And I think the way which the Bibas family was, the way the funeral went yesterday with pretty much a depression, a sort of wave of sadness over this entire country, of that poor mum and her 2 kids. Firstly, if you're Israeli, this hit you hard. If you're a parent, this was devastating. And I think if you have a humanistic bone in your body, then this was devastating. And of course, the way which their bodies were paraded by Hamas. I mean, all of us here who've become somewhat used to the barbarity of this death cult, this shocked us to our very core. For heaven's sake, parading the bodies of dead children. And then after that, on that stage, a whole bunch of Gazan kids laughing and shouting and singing as in some sort of victory. This really is a death cult. And Israel cannot live next to this terrorist organization. There's no way that can happen.
All right, stay tuned. Coming up after the break, we'll have Timur Durrani from the Globe and Mail with us to discuss the discovery of what are believed to be human remains in a landfill near Winnipeg. This follows the theory that the remains of two First Nations women murdered by Jeremy Skibicki ended up at that landfill in May 2022. After that, it's Election Day in Ontario, and voters get to decide whether to trade in their Ford. We'll have these stories and more news right after the break. Searchers at a landfill near Winnipeg think they may have found human remains. It's believed that the remains of murdered First Nations women Morgan Harris and Mercedes Myron ended up at the landfill in May 2022. The search began in December, and during a press briefing, Manitoba Premier Wab Kinew highlighted that the stage of the search is a difficult one and could stretch for a very long period of time.
So this is going to be a difficult stage. It could stretch on for a very long period of time. Of course, on a personal level, professional responsibility to manage expectations aside, on a personal level, I hope that this search concludes quickly with the result that the families are looking forward to. And I hope that we can then move on to helping them walk through the next stages of their healing journeys and of grieving their loved ones who were taken from them in what are some of the worst crimes that we've ever seen in the history of our province.
The provincial government spearheaded a search of the landfill after police had refused to search the area because of safety concerns. Following the discovery of the remains, Mr. Kinew took to X that the RCMP is now investigating and steps for identification are underway, and that the families of the women have been notified and attended the site. The Globe and Mail's Timur Durrani joined us from Winnipeg for more on the search. Timur, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, what do we know about what happens next in determining if the remains are human and if they are either Miss Harris or Miss Myron's?
Yeah, so this next stage is going to take at least a few weeks. Already, this is way ahead of time from what we've reported so far. And again, we've been at the top of the story from the beginning just about this. I mean, it's the reason why we've even established a new bureau here in Manitoba for me to be here. Part of that is because, this was a real problem all the way back to the 2023 general election, before which in 2022, these women were murdered. Over the course of last year, once the trial was wrapped up, which was a months-long trial for these four murdered women, when the serial killer was found guilty, after that, and along with it, the province really started in earnest to go through with this landfill search. And so now we're at this stage after they really truly started digging down in December, building all these different sites where they by hand went in. Now they have found human remains. Whose human remains they are, though, we still don't know. The province still has to confirm this fact, who this person is, who this woman is. That's something that the chief medical examiner's office and the RCMP are now going to be involved with. So it's going to take a little bit of time. After that, we could possibly have a funeral, the vigil. There's a lot of protocols set in place for that.
And if the remains are found to be human, what happens if it's not one of the victims?
I want to be clear, right now we know that they are human remains.
Okay.
What we don't know is which human this is. So they're possible that there's a sort of like specific thing about it. These are human remains. So this is why it's such a big deal for the families to be told finally that yes, this is happening. This is kind of, what you've been fighting for, what you've been told, that you've been asking for this. You want to make sure that the government goes through this search process, which again took government changes and police to change their opinions and a lot to get to this point, right? So that's why it's a big deal. The next stage now is to identify this person. So that could take at least 2 weeks. It could be done earlier. This stage of even finding these human remains, which were 18,000 cubic meters, like a whole mountain that they had to quite literally move at the top of this landfill to move it away, then by hand go through it. That's what's been done now. So they're not going to altogether stop the search. At this point, once they identify which woman, whoever these women are, if maybe there's specifically different people, that's something they're going to confirm over the next few weeks. So right now it's a bit of a halt in the search process to confirm exactly what's been found here.
Now, Premier Wab Kinew made the search an election promise during the campaign, and he did follow through with that once elected. Now, I mentioned already that he had posted on X yesterday an update of the new developments. Has he provided anything else since that post?
Yeah, so yesterday actually he we had an interview with him right last night. In fact, actually even the clip that you just played before, we'd reported that morning at the Globe because he told us about this in advance about that new stage. That was the final stage that is at this point sort of concluding at this point from this discovery of the human remains. From what Mr. Canoe told me yesterday, right now it's about the families. So it's just making sure that they're okay. It's just making sure that this discovery really allows them to sort of it's a very complicated thing to process. I mean, the whole thing really has been, but also to try to understand that, they might, what they found right now might not be the women that they went out looking for. In Manitoba, this is a real crisis for women, girls, Indigenous women, and Two-Spirit people. And so, this is something that's been happening for a while. The statistics are out there about how much of a real issue this is. And so we know how acute this problem is, thereby we don't know if this woman who was found there, if this person who was found there is another Indigenous person who has also gone missing or murdered. And we don't know if that is something that they'll find in this landfill. They'll continue to search for the other two women who they went out looking for, however.
Now, I do want to just talk about the landfill search in general. How daunting of a task is that? I mean, it was initially stopped because of safety concerns, but I couldn't imagine having to not only look through a landfill, but you're looking for human remains. How overwhelming is that for the searchers?
Absolutely. The searchers themselves have not been able to talk to us. It's a really gruesome, long process. I've been there at the site. Just the size itself feels enormous, and the amount of work that they've put in over the course of just a few months has been a lot. But for the families, this is something that they've always stressed about, that this is always possible. If someone goes missing here in Canada, especially, if this is someone that goes missing in the circumstances that these women went missing, we're going to go looking for them. At this point, this overwhelming process, this idea that, how much of this search led us up to this point is because of all of these workers that have been building these sites, these exact like full big buildings that they've built there at this landfill site to take away this mountain from one spot and put it into another spot, specifically going through by hand to make sure that the human remains that they might find there are left intact. So it's a really gruesome, heavy process. Over the course of my reporting when I've been there at the site, it's just been just a range of emotions for people because, again, also a lot of family members have volunteered to be part of this search process. So even those family members who are at the site are actually physically involved in helping the government with its search as well.
And throughout the Skibicki murder trial, you were in close contact with the families of the victims. And today, one of the daughters of the victims actually said in an interview, "I just want my mom." What would it mean for them if their loved ones were finally found and a proper funeral service could be held for the two women?
Absolutely. That was Elle today. She's the youngest daughter of Morgan Harris, one of the two women whose remains are potentially going to be found at this Prairie Green landfill. From the beginning, especially through the trial, in my conversation today with Elle, she kind of just, really made sure she wanted to highlight this, that it's a lot of complex emotions, right? You're trying to understand that there might be some hope here now, that you could finally get this dignified funeral, which is the reason why they've been fighting, to go to Ottawa, to go to Manitoba's legislature, which again, the ruling progressive conservative government at the time had put up billboards all over the province, had put up radio ads, and had put up newspaper spots saying that if you vote for us, we will listen to the Winnipeg police and not search for these women because it's too dangerous and too costly. This idea, and this is something that Premier Canoe mentioned to me yesterday as well, and the families mentioned again today, is it's showing us now, the idea that we've now found human remains at this landfill is showing us that it was feasible all along, that it was realistic all along, that this was something that could be done. In fact, only within a course of less than 3 months, right? In December, they went fully started digging down there and started sifting through things. At that point, they hadn't, but by then they'd only built up sites and they were planning, right? It took 3 months for them to find a possible human being there. So that's something that they, Elle really wanted to highlight, how the feasibility of this was something they wanted to stress all along. But it took them more than 3 years because they believed they were Indigenous women. And that's the reason why nobody wanted to listen to them, because of these systemic problems we have in Canada.
And with the homicide rate for Indigenous women in Canada being 6 times higher than the rate of non-Indigenous women and girls, is Canada doing anything to change this? You've touched on this multiple times that this is a problem in Canada, but are we seeing anyone actually taking the step to do something about it?
Yeah, I've actually talked to the federal Crown Indigenous Relations Minister, and he's talked about a lot of different initiatives he's been putting in. There's something called a red dress alert. Manitoba has been called sort of ground zero on this crisis, right? Because of the overwhelming population of Indigenous people here, this crisis really does feel like a real home ground problem where women go missing all the time, possibly murdered. We never even get to the stage of a criminal trial, as this case did, which again, even the judge gave us at the Globe an interview to tell us about how much of a template this case really is for us to examine what happens next. I think this case in particular, what you're sort of asking here is a question we should all ask ourselves as Canadians. At this point, we should ask ourselves, why have we let this happen for so long? Why is it that we don't treat Indigenous women, especially Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people who go missing, as human beings, and the same level that we would our own family member? And the families have stressed today, even community leaders like the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs stressed that at this point, the money that we're putting to these initiatives, the red dress alert, something like that the cops go looking immediately when a woman who goes missing because of this acute crisis, is going to help us. So we can't sort of look at it as just a money thing. This is a real crisis we're facing as a country. It's our long-term residential school history that gets back us to this point, where it makes us and reminds us that, we're still living this history of women going constantly missing and not feeling like they're human beings, and their families feeling like they're not the same things as any other people, as your daughter, my sister, somebody else would be.
Well, thank you so much for the time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, coming up after the break, Ontarians cast their votes today to decide who should be the next premier. And we'll be speaking to the General Counsel for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation about their legal case against the CBC over concerns about transparency. After that, we'll have more news from across Canada and around the world. Stay with us. Forum Daily will be right back after this. Today's the day Ontario voters decide whether or not to trade in their Ford. Progressive Conservative leader Doug Ford spent the final day of campaigning driving home his pitch that voters should give him another majority to send a strong message to the U.S.
But again, folks, there's one thing that's concerning to all of Canada, and that's the reason I'm wearing this jersey here, to make sure that Donald Trump understands very clearly he does need Canada. He does need our critical minerals. He does need the aluminum and the steel and the energy. And the 1.5 million homes in New York, in Michigan, and Minnesota, they need our energy. As I say, we keep the lights on in New York, Michigan, and Minnesota, and the governors appreciate it. No one agrees with President Trump declaring an economic war against his closest ally, his closest friend. So folks, we're going to fight like we've never fought before. I'm going to make sure we protect the families, we're going to protect the businesses, protect the jobs, and we're going to protect the communities.
NDP leader Marit Stiles said her party is the only one that would provide real change and fight rising costs for Ontarians.
Ontarians have a choice to make. And the Liberals are telling you that they are entitled to your vote. Well, you know what? The Liberals aren't entitled to anything. The Liberals have received donations from the same private healthcare insiders, the same Greenbelt developers that Doug Ford and the Conservatives have received donations from. We cannot afford to go down that road again. We need real change here. Right? We have the power of our vote to make real change. You have the power through your vote to fight rising costs with a grocery rebate program, with real rent control, and to put food on the table of so many Ontarians. You have the power with your vote to build affordable housing. We're going to get it done.
Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie reiterated her promises to get everyone in Ontario a family doctor and in hallway medicine.
Who do you trust to have the right priorities? Who do you trust to ensure that you have a family doctor? Who do you trust to ensure that you and your family will get ahead? You can trust Ontario's Liberals to do more for you and to get it right. Doug Ford has made a lot of promises over the years. He said he'd end hallway health care. He didn't get it done. He said he'd cut your taxes. He didn't get that done. He said he'd build 1.5 million homes, and he didn't get that done either. Our pledge and our commitment is to ensure that the 2.5 million people who don't have a family doctor in Ontario today have a doctor within 4 years, and that wait times are eliminated in our hospitals.
The PCs are expected to get 45% of the vote, with the Ontario Liberals at 29%, up 1 point from last week, while the Ontario NDP is down 5 points to 16%. Yesterday, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation announced that they are taking Canada's public broadcaster, the CBC, to court over concerns about transparency. The CTF requested records detailing how much the CBC has spent on advertising over the past 5 years, but the broadcaster has refused to release the information despite receiving $1.4 billion from taxpayers last year. The CTF has now filed a legal challenge in federal court to force the disclosure of these records. We were joined by CTF's General Counsel, Devin Drover. Devin, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, can you walk us through what specifically the CTF was looking for from the CBC and how we got to the point where we're at where you feel that you need to sue?
Absolutely. So here at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we fundamentally think that taxpayers have a right to know how their money is being spent. And this isn't just about the single instance of advertising. Our investigative journalist, Ryan Thorpe, files dozens of access to information requests trying to figure out how the CBC is spending our money. Some of them are what we think is simple questions. In this case, what is the dollar sign and how much they're spending on advertising? And they're refusing to tell us. As such, we have no other choice now but to file an action with federal court, which we did earlier this week, asking them to disclose these records. Fundamentally, we think, given the fact, as mentioned, the CBC receives $1.4 billion from taxpayers last year, and it's looking like the Trudeau government wants to increase the funding to the CBC this year. We think fundamentally that, financial records of any kind, whether it's advertising, which is the source of contention in this lawsuit, or some of the other issues that we've been encountering, for example, requesting how much they're spending on executive bonuses. We think this is all information that should be in the public domain. And if they're not willing to release this information, we're going to have no other choice but to take them to federal court and get those answers that taxpayers deserve.
Now, supporters of the CBC might argue that being forced to disclose those details may be exposing sensitive aspects of their business model. What do you make of that objection?
So I would understand if we were searching for, how much they bid on this specific ad spot, and thus, a competitor may be able to see, oh, if they're bidding X dollars, we can go in with X minus one and get this contract. We're not looking for that level of granularity here. Our request is just about the dollar figure. How much money did the CBC spend on advertising in 1 year? I don't think you'd have to be a business genius to look at those numbers and somehow get some competitive position or competitive advantage. Fundamentally, this is a very clear example of the CBC not being transparent with the people that they're accountable to, which are the taxpayers that fund them.
And can you explain to us what happens next in terms of the CBC's potential response and when this might actually end up in court?
Yeah, so we're urgently hoping that this matter gets heard as soon as possible, and we're going to make that request into the court. Of course, as you're no doubt aware, the courts are at a backlog right now, and we deal with this a lot in some of the ongoing lawsuits we have filed. However, we think this is an important issue to get dealt with as soon as possible. As you're no doubt aware, the future of the CBC is up for discussion in this federal election. You have the Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre announcing he wants to defund the CBC. And on the other side of the spectrum, you have the Liberal government right now in Ottawa that wants to increase funding to the CBC. So it's certainly a hot topic issue going into the election. And we think all Canadians should have the right to access this information before the election so that, one, their freedom of information or freedom of expression rights are not violated and they're able to scrutinize the government accordingly. And I think if you're the CBC, if you're a big proponent of the CBC, you should still see value in having this information disclosed, because having this out in the open will make the marketplace of ideas better and allow for better discussions about what involvement the CBC should have in Canadian society, whether it's Mr. Poilievre's view, a view we share that the CBC should be defunded, or a view shared by Justin Trudeau's Liberal government right now that funding should, as early as a few days ago, announced they wanted to double the funding or nearly double to 2.5 billion. So it's currently an important issue, and I think it's something that courts should be wanting to hear sooner rather than later, so this information can be out in time for the next federal election.
Hey, you did just mention that there's a court backlog. So, given that the court proceedings may take some time, critics of your organization might argue that the CTF is wasting taxpayers' money here because the CBC is going to have to pay lawyers to defend the organization in court. What would your response be to those critics?
I think that's, I mean, that may be true that the CBC will have to lawyer up now and fight back against this lawsuit. If they want to avoid wasting tax dollars on a legal challenge, they could disclose the information that from the outset. Again, we think that fundamentally Canadians have a right to access financial information when it involves the spending of tax dollars. And in this case, if the CBC doesn't want to incur the cost to fight against challenges like this, they can be transparent at the outset and can avoid all of these issues. And I'll be honest with you, this isn't the only lawsuit that we may bring against the CBC if they don't start to become transparent on the millions of or which executives are receiving millions of dollars in bonuses. We're going to be challenging them on that too, and we have a number of complaints in with the Office of the Information Commissioner right now. So I think if the CBC is concerned, or proponents of the CBC are concerned about the money being spent on these lawsuits, they could avoid the issue altogether and start being transparent about these funds.
Well, there have been lots of debates about what direction the CBC should go in. One of the larger debates has been the CBC's funding level, with some Liberals suggesting that the CBC should actually get more public funding. Do you think they should?
Absolutely not. I mean, I think if you look at the ratings for the CBC, they're pretty abysmal right now. It's very clear that Canadians are moving further and further away from the CBC and to alternative news sources, including the one I'm on right now. And I think I think there's less value in the CBC, in which Canadians have access to a lot of really great journalists on their smartphones and on other TV stations. So would be very disappointed to see any increase in funding to the CBC, especially when it is hard for any journalist to be independent, despite what they may say, when they know at the end of the day their checks are being signed by a politician. So we want to see more independent media and less tax dollars being used to bribe journalists.
Thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, don't go anywhere. Coming up after the break, we'll have more of today's top national and international headlines. Quebec's Court of Appeal hands down its ruling regarding the 2013 rail disaster. Dental hygienists urge federal parties to keep funding the National Dental Care Program, and an unknown illness has killed at least 50 people over 6 weeks in northwestern Congo. We'll have these stories and more news from around the world right after the break. Quebec's Court of Appeal agrees that Canadian Pacific Railway wasn't liable for the deadly 2013 Lac-Mégantic rail disaster. The province's High Court heard arguments to require the company to pay into a compensation fund for about 4,000 victims. But the three-judge panel upheld a lower court ruling that the railway did not have legal liability. CP Rail had argued the runway train wasn't operated by its employees and it didn't own the tracks where it derailed and exploded. Dental hygienists are urging federal parties to keep funding the National Dental Care Program. The Canadian Dental Hygienists Association argues that it's good for the economy since access to oral health care and preventative care increases worker productivity. The program has now been used by more than 1.3 million Canadians. Seniors, children, and people with disabilities who have household incomes of less than $90,000 and don't have private insurance are now eligible. Thousands of workers with the U.S. Agency for International Development who have been fired or placed on leave as part of Donald Trump's dismantling of the agency are being given 15 minutes today or tomorrow to clean out their workspaces. USAID has been one of the biggest targets so far of a campaign by Mr. Trump and his new Department of Government Efficiency. Many of the workers were insulted by the notice for retrieving their belongings. They were told not to bring weapons, including firearms, spear guns, and hand grenades. A woman is suspected in a string of vandalism against a Colorado Tesla dealership, including throwing Molotov cocktails at vehicles. Lucy Grace Nelson was arrested on Monday after police said that she returned to the dealership with more incendiary devices. The vandalism also included the words Nazi cars spray painted on the building and a message that appears to be directed against Elon Musk. The case comes amid raising concerns from Democrats and some Republicans about Mr. Musk's influence over the Trump administration. An unknown illness has killed over 50 people in northwestern Congo in 6 weeks. That's according to doctors on the ground and the World Health Organization's Africa office. A hospital medical director there told the Associated Press that's what's really worrying is that in the majority of cases, the interval between the onset of symptoms and death has been just 48 hours. The outbreak began January 21st, and there have been 4,109 cases, including 53 deaths. According to the World Health Organization's Africa office, the first outbreak started after 3 children reportedly ate a dead bat. They died 2 days after developing a group of illnesses characterized by fever, bleeding, headache, joint pain, and other symptoms. Earlier, we were joined by Dr. Abhishek Raut, medical director at Appletree Medical Group, to discuss why information about the deaths have been made public just now.
Well, I think that's an excellent question. And I think the delay in making this information public, we can look at different factors for that. I think firstly, we're looking at a very rapid onset and progression of the illness, many symptoms appearing and leading to death within 48 hours. So it makes it very challenging for local health authorities to really identify and respond quickly. Also, we're looking at a remote location of affected areas in northwestern Congo. We're seeing villages of Boloko and Bomate likely contributed to all of those delays as well in communication and reporting. And what we do see, though, is there have been quite a few initial efforts made to identify the cause of that illness as well. And that involves extensive testing for hemorrhagic fever diseases like Ebola, dengue, Marburg, and yellow fever. All of those take a lot of time to process as well, and it requires samples to be sent to the National Institute for Biomedical Research in Kinshasa. So all of that, with the complexity of the situation, likely contributed to that delay in publicizing.
And with the onset of symptoms and death being just 48 hours, many are wondering how serious this illness is and what numbers will have to be reached for the World Health Organization to declare this as an emergency.
You know, the concern here is it is very serious, with symptoms leading to death within 48 hours. We're seeing a very high fatality rate, and the speed on which it affects individuals is a significant concern. Right now, we've seen 419 recorded cases and 53 deaths. It's complex on how the WHO makes that decision. Typically, to declare an event as a public health emergency of international concern, we have certain criteria that need to be met as well. Really, the decision involves the severity of the public health impact. Does the illness pose a significant risk to human health? There's the risk of international spread, so the disease must have a potential to spread beyond the borders of the affected country. And certainly a need for a coordinated international response. Those are the 3 big criteria that is used. Now, in this case, with the rapid onset and the high fatality rate, combined with the potential of that disease to spread, it is something that I'm sure the WHO is going to be closely monitoring to see if it makes that declaration.
This mysterious illness is just part of a larger trend of viruses jumping from animals to humans. In fact, in areas where wild animals are eaten, these types of viruses are up by 60% since 2022. We asked Dr. Raut on why there is a spike.
So I do note that we do see a significant increase in these zoonotic diseases there. Certainly, I know that the WHO is actively monitoring it, but we are seeing potential reasons on why this is happening. So first of all, the complexity of zoonotic diseases is quite various, where you have to look at coordination between human, animal, and the environment. So the WHO has what we call the One Health approach that works in collaboration between human health, animal health, and environmental health to really look at preventing and controlling zoonotic diseases. Secondly, I think we're seeing a large and rapid urbanization and population growth in certain parts of Africa, which in any case will lead to significant human-animal interactions. And so what we will see is those interactions can be derived from, of course, actual meeting of human and animal, but also the demand of food delivered from animals, meat, poultry, eggs, and milk. And so certainly we increase that risk for zoonotic pathogens to spread. And then finally, we see a lack of resources and infrastructure in some areas, and that can pose a significant challenge because you need those resources for effective surveillance, early detection, and rapid response. So what we do see is there's complexities involved in this, and I know the WHO is likely actively working to address that, but zoonotic diseases do cause a lot of complexity, and it's always difficult to respond very quickly to that.
Some have speculated that it's possible that this mysterious virus is a new strand of malaria.
So what we do know about malaria, specifically in that region, is it's very strongly endemic. The Democratic Republic of Congo had about 27 million malaria infections and about 24,000 deaths of the disease in 2022. So in this particular outbreak, some samples have tested positive for malaria, which does suggest that malaria could be a contributing factor. But what we are seeing, though, is the rapid onset, a high fatality rate, and symptoms like fever, vomiting, diarrhea, nosebleeds, and fatigue implies more that there may be other factors here at play. And it certainly is possible that this outbreak involves a very severe form of malaria, but certainly there are other factors we would look at first, see if that is playing a greater role here.
And with the COVID-19 pandemic now behind us and more attention being paid to the spread of new viruses, we asked Dr. Rout about the concern for this becoming another pandemic.
I think it's understandable. We all have that initial reaction when we see news like this, whether this is going to lead to another pandemic state. And certainly with COVID-19 in the back of our minds, always there are concerns of that. But looking at COVID-19, there are some factors you've got to consider. Now, the pandemic, which was caused by the SARS-CoV-2 virus, had very unique combination of characteristics that contributed to this rapid global spread. They had a very high transmission rate, they had asymptomatic carriers, and the ability to spread through respiratory droplets. So that's a very dangerous combination. You can see how very quickly that could spread throughout. In the case of the current outbreak there in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the illness has shown now a rapid onset, high fatality rate, and symptoms leading to death very quickly within 48 hours. But the transmission dynamics and the exact cause of the illness are still really being investigated. And this preliminary analysis at least suggests that the outbreak may be linked more to the consumption of bat meat, but we don't know specifically what the pathogen is that has been identified. So it's important to monitor the situation there, but there are very key differences here between this outbreak and COVID-19. And I do think that overall we should be cautious, but I don't expect that we are going to lead to another pandemic.
Pope Francis is continuing his slow recovery from double pneumonia and is beating back speculation of an imminent death, resignation, or conclave. The Vatican said the 88-year-old pontiff slept well again during the night at a Rome hospital and was resting this morning. Yesterday, doctors reported further improvements in his clinical condition pertaining to his kidneys, blood work, and complex lung infection. New details are emerging about 95-year-old Oscar-winning actor Gene Hackman's death in New Mexico. A search warrant shows that Mr. Hackman, his wife, and their dog had been dead for some time, and the couple's bodies were in different rooms when deputies found them while conducting a wellness check. Mr. Hackman was found dead yesterday in a mudroom, and his wife was found dead in a bathroom next to a space heater. There was an open prescription bottle of pills scattered on the countertop near his wife. I'm Teresa Skubik, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. For more news on demand, you can always visit our website at forumdailynews.ca and make sure to follow us on social media on X and TikTok. You can also watch all of our commentary programming on the Newsforum YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us on Forum Daily News. We'll see you next time. Good night, Canada.